Hello and welcome to my book discussion video for George Orwell's 1984 and We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. In this video, we're going to be discussing the claim that George Orwell ripped off Zamyatin while writing 1984. First, I've read both of these books, and 1984 is one of my favorite books of all time. But after careful review of this situation, I do admit I toiled a bit with the amount of originality that we credit George Orwell with here. However, I'm not sure that overall I can allow this to tarnish the brilliance that is the in-piece of 1984. So, let's present the facts and see what you think. 1. Yevgeny was a Russian author and his book was written in the early 1920s. George Orwell published his book 1984 in 1949, about 30 years later. Next, George Orwell wrote a literary review of We in 1946, just a few short years before publishing his very own 1984. My favorite thing of this review is that it's the most damning piece of evidence against Orwell, because he perfectly summarizes the book from which he so heavily borrows. The reason I point this out is because when we think of how one author can be inspired by another author, we often think of it as more of an organic evolution of thought. For instance, if I wrote my own book inspired by Orwell's 1984, maybe I would create a similar setting, but the inner works of the plot and characters would be very much my own. Or maybe my inner pitch would sound something like, what if Winston turned out to be a total boss and went Rambo on Big Brother? Well, then we have John Carpenter's They Live. It's something similar, but altogether new and different. But in this case, Orwell doesn't just create a similar setting, he creates similar characters and a similar plot, and then he even points out all the stuff he borrowed in this review that I'm talking about. Here's a few things they both share in common. First, the setting. In We, a surveillance state known as the One State has an authoritarian leader known as the Benefactor. Everything people say and do, and any attempts at individuality are closely monitored by the government. In 1984, we are in a place called Oceania, where the authoritarian government, referred to as the Party, controls the flow of information and is always watching. Additionally, we have the characters in the plot. As a character-driven story, both of them in this case, the characters and plot tend to blend together. But the equivalent of Winston in We is D503, who falls in love with I330, who is Julia's equivalent from 1984. I330, like Julia, is a figure in this underground resistance. Winston, D503, sees her tortured by the Party, the One State, and basically proceeds to sell her out, and she gets tortured, and if it's all starting to sound a little too similar, it's because it is. It's interesting to note that George Orwell's review of We suggests that Aldous Huxley clearly borrowed ideas from it as well, and he must have taken this as a personal invitation to do one better. Unfortunately, even in the finer details, Orwell borrowed some concepts. The one that stood out to me personally while reading We is that there's a scene that involves a museum of sorts that preserves these artifacts from life before, and it's sort of curated by this old person, and it really got me thinking of the apartment in 1984 where Winston and Julia lived a secret but free life together, and it's a similar tool in essence to drive a very similar idea. There are some key differences, don't get me wrong. Primarily, 1984 takes place in a world that I would describe as clearly dystopian, whereas We is one of those utopias that is a dystopia in disguise, more comparable to Brave New World. The tone is also very different, as 1984 just feels like a much darker story overall and a more personal story. Also, the methods of control from the Party are much more central to the story and elaborate. But to settle the question of is it plagiarism, we have to ask, what was George Orwell's intent? Did he try to take something that was somebody else's idea and pass it off as his own? The waters are murky here, and I think the answer is somewhere in between, as he was a little bit more than just inspired by We. He used the book's framework as somewhat of a template, in my opinion, but I don't think Orwell tried to hide this fact or claim that he was writing some highly original piece of work. Rather, that's something attributed to this piece by the readers. And ultimately, I do believe that 1984 is transformative enough to stand on its own and have its own identity. And if you could somehow write a cover song in book form, that's kind of how I would describe this one. Despite my forgiving take on this, George Orwell isn't out of the woods just yet, because his book Animal Farm has also been contested as a form of plagiarism due to its similarities to a 1924 Polish novel that was inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, called The Revolt of the Animals. Now, originally, this book was titled Bunt, and they changed the name due to the popularity, probably, of Animal Farm. It seems highly unlikely that George Orwell even read this one to me because it wasn't translated in English until much, much later. But people love to cash in on the who did it first thing. I have started reading this one, but I haven't finished. If you'd like me to do a deeper dive on that one, please let me know in the comments down below and feel free to weigh in yourself.